I want to tell you something that nobody tells you before you sign up for off-world guard duty. They don't tell you how quiet it gets. Not the kind of quiet you know from back home, not like the silence before a thunderstorm rolls in over the plains, or the hush of an empty church on a Wednesday afternoon. This is different. This is the quiet of standing in a corridor that smells like recycled mineral air and filtered starlight, guarding a door that belongs to someone who doesn't think you're real. Not real in the sense of alive, she knows you're alive. Real in the sense of worth considering. The first time the Lady Avara Vel Sovereign laughed at me, I was standing at the entrance to her receiving chamber with my hands behind my back, my spine straight, my eyes forward, exactly the way they drilled it into us at the academy. She walked past me like I was a piece of furniture, paused, looked me up and down the way someone might look at a decorative vase they didn't choose for themselves and weren't particularly impressed with. And then she said something to her attendant, her Churath, a small silver-skinned creature who translated for her in those early weeks before my language implant fully synced, and they both made this sound. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel exactly, but it was unmistakable. She was laughing at me. I stood there and I let her. Because that's what the contract said, that's what the job was. But here's the thing about Ezra Callahan from Billings, Montana, Earth, Sol system. Third rock from a perfectly average yellow star in the unfashionable western arm of the Milky Way. I was patient. I had been patient through things that would have broken most species in this galaxy twice over before breakfast. And I could wait. Set up. Let me back up. Let me give you the picture properly, because if I don't, none of the rest of it makes sense. My name is Ezra Callahan. I'm 31 years old by Earth reckoning, which apparently translates to approximately 47 standard galactic years, which made me, according to the Velthari social hierarchy, somewhere between a seasoned adult and a mildly impressive elder, depending on which species you asked. The Velthari themselves lived for 300 or 400 standard years on average, which meant that to Avara, who was something like 120, I was essentially a very small child in a big coat. That's important context. Hold on to that. I grew up in Montana. Wide open land, cold winters that didn't ask permission, wind that came down off the Rockies like it had a personal grudge. My family had a small cattle operation, nothing impressive, nothing fancy, and I spent the first 18 years of my life doing the kind of work that most people in the developed world had already automated away. Fencing, hauling, moving cattle through weather that didn't care about your schedule. My father had a saying, the land doesn't owe you anything, so don't go expecting favors. I joined the Terran Expeditionary Corps at 22, right after Earth's formal admission to the Galactic Conclave. The Corps was new. Everything was new. Humans had only been making formal contact with the wider galaxy for about 15 years at that point, and most of the species we were meeting still weren't sure what to make of us. The Conclave had these designated exchange programs, diplomatic, cultural, military, designed to facilitate what they called interspecies familiarization. What that actually meant was, we're going to put humans in places where other species can observe them up close, and we'll see how that goes. Guard service was one of those placements. The Corps recruited from veterans, from law enforcement, from military backgrounds. I'd spent 4 years in the Montana National Guard before the Corps came recruiting, and 3 years after that as a contract security consultant in some places that I'm not going to name here, because some of those contracts are still technically sealed. Point is, by the time I got the assignment to the Velthari posting, I had about 9 years of experience in security work, and about 0 experience in anything resembling galactic nobility. They prepped us, of course. 42 days of cultural orientation at the Conclave's training facility on Luna. We learned Velthari customs, hierarchy structures, etiquette protocols, dietary considerations, physical boundaries. We learned that the Velthari were one of the oldest species in the Conclave third founding members, which was a distinction that apparently carried enormous social weight. We learned that they were physically striking, tall, between 7 and 8 feet on average, with elongated limbs, iridescent skin that shifted color based on emotional state, and eyes that were solid black with thin rings of bioluminescent color that also indicated mood. We learned that they considered most younger species, new bloods they called them, to be essentially developmental projects. Charming, perhaps, occasionally useful, but not quite serious. And we learned, very specifically, that humans were currently ranked in Velthari social consciousness somewhere between novelty and mild curiosity. There had been a debate in the conclave chambers about whether Terran Guard candidates were appropriate for noble household posting. Some Velthari houses had objected outright. They wanted experienced species, established species, species with a track record in the conclave. The House of Sovereign had accepted the placement partly as a political gesture toward the new human-friendly faction in the conclave chamber, and partly, I learned much later, because Lady Avara herself had specifically requested a human out of what could only be described as anthropological interest. She wanted to study one up close. That was essentially my job description. I found that out on day 3. I found it out because her Churath, the silver-skinned attendant, whose name was Thessaly and who turned out to be one of the most quietly perceptive beings I've ever met, pulled me aside in the corridor while Avara was in her bath and said, very matter-of-factly, "She intends to observe you for the duration of your posting. Please don't take personal offense." I remember I just looked at Thessaly for a moment. "Observe me," I said. "Your species," Thessaly said. "She's compiling a behavioral study. She's done this with 4 other new blood species over the past century. The Druvani, the Carrot, the Pollen, and the Simsh. It's something of a hobby." I said. "She doesn't intend cruelty," Thessaly added, in the tone of someone who was not entirely certain that was true. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. And I went back to my post. The station itself, Conclave Station Myrth 9, was a marvel that I never quite stopped noticing, even after months aboard it. It was built into the hollowed core of a dead asteroid about twice the size of Manhattan, and the Conclave had been expanding and rebuilding it for something like 600 years, which meant it had this layered quality to it. Ancient stone corridors running alongside gleaming transit tubes, original carved archways from the founding species sitting right next to holographic signage in 40 different languages. It smelled different in different sections. The Velthari Quarter had this faint mineral scent, like rain on limestone, which I later learned was a synthetic atmospheric blend designed to approximate their homeworld's signature air chemistry. The human quarters smelled aggressively of nothing, which I'd initially taken as a neutral choice, and later understood was because nobody had gotten around to deciding what Earth was supposed to smell like. The Lady Avara's residential suite occupied the upper tier of the Velthari Quarter, 6 interconnected chambers, a private garden pavilion with genuine imported soil from Solen Prime, and a viewport that looked out over the asteroid's exposed mineral face with the stars beyond it. It was stunning in the way that things are stunning when someone has never had to worry about the cost. My post was outside her primary receiving chamber. 12 hours on, 12 hours off, with a secondary guard, a Carrot named Orvis built like a very professional boulder, 4 arms, generally pleasant, covering the other shift. We worked well together. Orvis didn't say much. I didn't say much. We'd nod when we switched shifts, and that was enough. The first week, Avara ignored me almost completely. The second week, she started looking at me when she passed, the way you'd look at an interesting rock formation, assessing. The third week, she started making comments. Not to me, never directly to me, at first. To Thessaly in Velthari, a language that sounds, to human ears, like wind chimes being played backward underwater, with occasional sharp consonants that land like punctuation. My implant was still calibrating, catching maybe 30%, but I caught enough. Shorter than I expected. Those hands, did you notice? The fingers are so thick, like tool appendages. It hasn't moved in 3 hours. Does it sleep standing up? I didn't react. I'd learned early in the Corps in the contract work, and honestly as far back as that freezing winter I spent fencing in the dark because the cattle had pushed through a section near the north pasture, and my father needed it done before the ground froze. That reacting to being underestimated was a waste of energy. Better to let people build their assumptions. Better to let them get comfortable. The laugh happened on day 19. She came through the corridor with 2 visiting nobles, house members, by the color of their garments, and they were in high spirits about something. A function at the conclave chambers, probably. Avara was in a cobalt-and silver formal draping that made her iridescent skin shift toward pale blue, which I'd learned indicated something like pleasant confidence. She paused outside my post, and one of the visiting nobles said something. My implant caught your human fixture. And Avara looked at me with that assessing expression and said something in response. My implant gave me maybe 60% by then. The gist of it was, it's very earnest. The humans are, you know how they are, very serious about small things. And all three of them made that sound. That light, airy, not quite cruel laugh. I stood there with my hands behind my back and my eyes forward. And I thought about a January morning in Montana when I was 16, walking a fence line in -20 wind chill because that's what needed doing, and my father walking beside me not saying a word, just walking, because some things you didn't need to talk about. You just did them. I thought about that, and I let the laughter go. Build tension. The months aboard Myrth 9 fell into rhythm. Not a comfortable rhythm, I'm not going to dress it up that way. It was the rhythm of someone existing in a space where they were considered decorative at best. I watched Avara conduct her affairs. I watched conclave politics happen in the chambers she moved through. I watched species interact with her that had centuries of relationship with the Velthari, and I watched how they looked at me, the human fixture, the novelty guard, the new blood placement, and learned to read the flavors of being overlooked. There's a difference I figured out between being invisible and being dismissed. Invisible is neutral. Dismissed has a texture to it, a slight angle in how people hold their bodies when they pass you. A half-second less time than courtesy requires. It's not hostile. It's just a practiced, unconscious kind of not taking you seriously. I was very taken seriously by no one for about 3 months. And then things started to shift. Quietly, gradually, the way things shift when you don't force them. The first thing that changed was Thessaly. About 6 weeks in, Thessaly started talking to me during the quiet hours, the late shifts when the Velthari quarter was dim and still, and Avara was sleeping. Thessaly didn't need much sleep apparently, a carrot-adjacent biology that ran on 4-hour cycles, and they'd materialize in the corridor with 2 cups of something warm that smelled like dark fruit and mineral water, and set one down near my post without ceremony. I didn't ask about it, I just drank it. After about a week of this, Thessaly said, "You don't complain." "About what?" I said. "Any of it," Thessaly said. I thought about that. "Not much point," I said. Thessaly was quiet for a moment. The Druvani guard that held this post 3 decades ago complained constantly. He found the hours exhausting. The Carrot guard before that objected to the atmospheric blend and required a personal air unit. The Simsh candidate they tested briefly left after 11 days. "Left why?" I said. "Homesickness," Thessaly said. Then, after a pause, and because Lady Avara told her companions within the guard's hearing that Simsh faces reminded her of decorative gourds. I made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "She's a piece of work," I said, which my implant rendered into galactic standard as something like she is a complex individual, which was close but not quite right. Thessaly looked at me with those pale green eyes and said, "Yes, she is." "Do you like her?" I asked. It was probably too direct a question. But it was late, and the corridor was quiet, and I was tired of performing small talk. Thessaly considered this seriously, which I appreciated. "She is brilliant," Thessaly said finally. "And she is lonely in the way that very brilliant people are lonely when they have never been required to be humble." That was one of the best sentences I'd ever heard anyone say about anyone. "That tracks," I said. The second thing that changed was the incident in the Conclave Gardens. Myrth 9 Central Hub had a pressurized biodome, massive, 6 or 7 stories of enclosed atmospheric space, filled with imported plant life from a dozen worlds. It was a public space, accessible to all Conclave residents and registered visitors, and Avara walked through it twice a week in the mornings for what she called contemplative exercise, which meant she walked slowly and looked at things, and occasionally said something cutting about whatever species was gardening that section. I flanked her at the standard protective distance, 3 paces back and to the left, which was the Velthari preference. Orvis usually covered the morning shift, but he'd had a family matter 3 stations away, and I'd picked up the extra hours. We were in the human-maintained section, a small corner near the eastern wall where the Corps had arranged for some Earth species to be planted, mostly hardy things that could handle recycled atmosphere. Mountain grasses, a couple of shrub varieties, something that looked vaguely like sage. It wasn't impressive compared to the bioluminescent forests from the carrot section or the towering crystalline vine things from Velthari, but it smelled faintly like home. I didn't react, kept my distance, kept my eyes moving, scanning the garden the way I was supposed to. Ivara paused near the earth plants. She studied them for a moment, said something to Thessaly. My implant caught sparse and practical, and what might have been they didn't bring much, did they? And then she moved on. But here's the thing. About 50 meters ahead, there was a group of 3 beings near the central fountain. 2 Druvani and 1 species I didn't immediately recognize, tall, quadrupedal in the rear, bipedal up front, with a broad, flat head and iridescent scales that were definitely not Velthari because they were the wrong color pattern. They were clustered around the fountain, and as Ivara approached, still within my scan range, still 3 paces back, one of them moved toward her with a very specific kind of purposefulness that I'd learned to recognize not from guard training, but from every piece of contract work I'd ever done. That wasn't a greeting, that was an intercept. The being, the scale-end flathead one, planted itself directly in Ivara's path and said something in a language my implant struggled with for half a second before cycling through to a partial translation. House sovereign owes House Verak a debt that has not been honored. We require. Ivara stopped walking. Her skin shifted toward deep violet, which I'd learned was closer to cold fury than fear. She said something clipped. I was already moving. Not running, not making noise. But I closed the 3 paces in about a second and a half, and I was standing at Ivara's left shoulder before the scale being had finished its second sentence. And I put myself there with a very specific kind of presence that isn't about aggression, isn't about posturing. It's about occupying space in a way that says the geometry of this situation just changed. The scale being looked at me. I looked at the scale being. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I was 6'1" and I had a very particular way of standing, something I'd learned partly from the Corps and partly from years of working around large, potentially unpredictable animals in the dark. That communicated. I am not alarmed, I am not bluffing, and I will be here as long as I need to be. The scale being looked at Ivara, then back at me. Then it took 1 step back. It said something else, quieter, with a different tone, something my implant rendered as this is not finished, and it moved away with the 2 Druvani trailing it. I went back to my position, 3 paces left shoulder. Ivara hadn't moved through all of this. She stood perfectly still, her skin cycling through that violet into something I hadn't seen before, a sort of deep iridescent teal that I had no reference for yet. She looked at me over her shoulder, not the assessing look, a different look. Then she turned forward and kept walking. She didn't say anything. But that was the first time she'd really looked at me. Over the following weeks, I noticed small changes. Ivara's comments, the ones she made to Thessaly about me, the ones she thought I couldn't catch, shifted in character. She stopped commenting on my appearance, my proportions, my stillness. She started making different observations. It moves efficiently when it needs to. Did you notice how it positioned itself? I didn't give a signal. The Druvani was twice its mass, and it didn't hesitate. She was still calling me it, which was, well, I was working on my Velthari, and I was letting that one go for now. But the quality of her attention had changed. Thessaly noticed too. She's reclassifying you, Thessaly told me one night with the dark fruit tea. From what to what? I asked. Thessaly considered this. From curiosity to variable, Thessaly said, which was apparently a Velthari scientific term for something whose behavior couldn't be entirely predicted in advance. I'll take it, I said. The 3rd shift was the slow one, the internal one, and it was mine alone. I started learning Velthari properly. Not just the implant-assisted version, but properly, working through the audio files at night, in my quarters, the way I'd once worked through fencing diagrams as a kid when we were trying to figure out why cattle kept pushing a particular section. Methodically, repeatedly, without expecting it to be fast. At the 60-day mark, I caught something Ivara said to Thessaly before my implant kicked in. She said, he's been studying our language. Thessaly said, yes. Ivara was quiet for a moment. Then, how much does he understand? And Thessaly, bless Thessaly, said quite calmly, more than you've assumed, my lady. And there was a pause, a long one. I kept my eyes forward and my face absolutely neutral, and I did not smile. I did not smile even a little. The actual turning point, the thing that changed everything, didn't happen on my Earth 9. It happened on Solen Prime, 4 months into my posting, when Ivara returned to her homeworld for the Velthari High Season gathering, and I went with her as part of the expanded security detail. Solen Prime is, and I'm going to take a minute here because it deserves it, the most beautiful planet I've ever been on. And I've been on 11 planets now, counting moons that have independent atmospheres, so that's not a small statement. The Velthari homeworld has this quality of light that I can only describe as layered. Their star sits slightly off-center in the system, and it has 2 companion dwarf stars in a distant orbit, and the way all 3 of them catch Solen Prime's atmospheric particulates at different angles throughout the day means the sky is never one color. It moves. It shifts. Blues and golds, and that particular shade of soft copper that I'd never seen in a sky before and haven't seen since. The high season estates were inland from the main Velthari coastal cities, massive, ancient compounds built into living stone formations that the Velthari had been cultivating and shaping for 10,000 years. House Sovereign's estate was one of the older ones, a sprawl of connected structures that rose and fell with the natural rock formation it was built into, covered in grown stone terracing, and the particular bioluminescent garden cultivars that Velthari nobility maintained as status indicators. I was assigned to the residential wing, Ivara's personal quarters and the 3 adjacent reception chambers, 6 guards total in the expanded detail, 4 Velthari house guards who'd been with the house for decades, Orvis who'd rejoined us for the surface posting, and me. The house guards were polite, professionally polite, the way people are when they've been told to be polite. They didn't say much to me. They looked at me the way Ivara had looked at me in those first weeks, with that assessing, not quite dismissive quality. I didn't push it, I just did the job. Climax. The high season lasted 16 days by Solen Prime's calendar. I spent most of it standing in stone-floored corridors that smelled like deep earth, and that particular mineral copper rain scent that was native to this region of the continent, watching nobility arrive and depart, listening with my now considerably improved Velthari as conversations happened around me that I was theoretically not supposed to understand. The political situation within the Velthari houses, I was learning, was more complicated than the briefing materials had suggested. The conclave had a dozen major Velthari houses, and 3 of them were in various stages of active dispute over territorial rights to a cluster of resource-rich moons near the Solen system's outer boundary. House Sovereign was one of the 3, and the other 2, Houses Verak and Kalandri, were apparently not above using the high season social calendar as cover for negotiations that were not quite negotiations, or threats that were not quite threats. The scale being from my Earth 9 garden had been a Verak agent. I'd gathered that over the months since the garden incident. And Verak was here. On day 11 of high season, there was a formal gathering in House Sovereign's primary terrace garden, a sprawling outdoor space set into the rock formation's natural amphitheater shape, open to that moving Solen sky, lit by hanging bioluminescent cultivation pieces that looked like small stars had been borrowed for decoration. Approximately 60 Velthari nobles, plus their attendants and guard details, plus a scattering of conclave observers from other species. I was posted at the garden's eastern entrance, interior-facing, which meant I was watching the guests, not the perimeter. Ivara was at the center of it, politically, literally. She stood at the gathering point, which was a carved stone platform in the garden's middle, talking to 3 other house senior members, her skin cycling through that pleasant, confident blue she wore when she was in social command of a situation. I was watching the room. That's the job. Most people don't understand what security work actually looks like, because in entertainment it looks like action, like response, like the exciting moment. But 95% of it is watching the room. It's tracking who's moving and how, who's looking at whom, where the clusters of conversation are, and whether they're holding or shifting. It's pattern recognition, mostly. You learn what a normal room looks like, and you watch for the thing that doesn't fit. About 40 minutes into the gathering, I noticed a change in the conversation cluster nearest the northern terrace wall. 4 Verak delegates, I'd learned to identify House Verak by their particular deep crimson formal drapings, had separated from the main socializing area and were now gathered in the northern corner. They weren't talking to each other. They were watching the room, too. I marked them. 10 minutes later, I noticed that 2 Kalandry delegates had positioned themselves at the southern entrance to the terrace garden, which was the direction toward the residential wing. They weren't watching the gathering. They were watching the path. I updated my mental map. 3 minutes after that, I noticed that the Velthari house guard who'd been posted at the northern terrace wall, one of the 4 senior guards who'd been polite but professional with me, was no longer at his post. Not a rotation, no replacement, just gone. I thought about that for about 4 seconds. Then I said very quietly into the comm unit at my collar, core issue, encrypted, not on the House Sovereign Guard network, Orvis. Orvis's voice came back immediately. He was posted at the garden's main entrance. Callahan. Northern wall, House Guard is off post. 4 Verak delegates sitting quiet in the corner, 2 Kalandry near the south exit. I want you to walk the perimeter without looking like you're walking the perimeter. Eastern Arc. A pause. You sure? No, I said, but I want to be wrong. Orvis started moving. I kept watching. The Verak delegates in the northern corner shifted almost imperceptibly. One of them moved a half step. The angle changed. They were now forming a loose, natural-looking configuration that happened to be pointing toward the stone platform where Avara was standing. And then something happened in my chest. Not fear exactly. A kind of clarification, the way the picture resolves when you've been looking at something blurry and you finally bring it into focus. This was an actual threat. Not a posturing intercept in a public garden, not a political comment at a social function. Something had been arranged here, probably with the cooperation of the missing house guard, and it was aimed at Avara, and it was going to move in the next few minutes while the gathering was at its social peak and attention was distributed. I said very quietly into the comm, Orvis, this is live, I'm going to the principal. Copy, Orvis said, and I could already hear the shift in his voice. That snap of focus that combat-experienced beings have when the situation goes from potential to actual. I moved. I covered the garden floor at a pace that wasn't running, but covered ground fast. The Corps called it tactical passage, a trained gait designed to move quickly without signaling alarm to a room, and I came up beside Avara in about 15 seconds. She turned to look at me, and for a fraction of a second that assessing expression was back, the what is the human fixture doing expression, and I said, in Velthari, not perfect Velthari, but functional Velthari, my lady, I need you to step back from this position. Slowly. Maintain your conversation if possible. The 3 House members she'd been talking to looked at me, various expressions. Avara looked at me. Her skin, which had been that confident blue, flickered. Explain, she said, in Velthari, short. 4 Verak delegates have positioned in the northern corner, I said. Your house guard post at the northern wall is vacant. 2 Kalandry are blocking the south exit. The configuration suggests a coordinated movement. I recommend immediate relocation. Silence. Maybe 2 seconds. Then Avara said to the 3 House members with perfect social ease, in a tone that sounded completely like a pleasant conversational pivot. Forgive me. I've just remembered something I need to attend to. Lord Vareth, shall we continue in the inner hall? And she stepped backward off the platform without looking hurried, and the 3 House members came with her, and I was at her left shoulder, and we were moving toward the interior archway. Orvis appeared from the eastern arc as we cleared the garden. I don't know how he moved that fast for something with 4 arms and that much mass. And he fell in on the right, and we had her between us through the archway and into the stone corridor before anyone in the garden had visibly reacted. Interior room, I said. The study, Avara said, still with that perfect evenness, and Thessaly, who had appeared from somewhere because Thessaly was always appearing from somewhere, led us down the corridor and through a carved door into a smaller chamber with stone walls on 3 sides and a single narrow window. I got Avara to the far wall. Orvis took the door. I said into the comm, House Sovereign Residence Security Team, this is Callahan, Terran Guard Detachment. I need a full head count on all posted guards, and I need it now. North Wall Post is unoccupied and unaccounted for. Treat as a security incident in progress. A pause longer than I'd have liked. Then one of the senior house guards, a veteran named Solver who I'd exchanged approximately 15 words with over 11 days, came back, confirming, North Wall Guard Harath is not responding to comm. We're cycling. Lock the garden exits, I said. Don't alarm the guests. Station your people on the Verak and Kalandri delegates. Don't approach, just observe. Can you do that without triggering anything? Another pause, yes. Do it. I turned around. Ivara was standing against the far wall of the study, which was lined with what appeared to be ancient Velthari text carvings, and she was looking at me. Not the assessing look, not the what is the fixture doing look. A look I hadn't seen on her face before. She said in Velthari, you identified this before my own house security. Yes, my lady, I said. How? I thought about how to answer that. About Montana and the freeze that comes before a blizzard, how the cattle always knew before the instruments. About the contract work in places where the pattern of a room could mean the difference between a normal day and not a normal day. About my father's fence lines and the way you learned to see where the pressure was building before it broke through. I've been watching rooms for a long time, I said. Ivara's skin cycled slowly through colors I didn't have vocabulary for yet. She was quiet. In the corridor outside, I could hear the organized sound of the House Sovereign security team moving through the estate, professional and controlled, no panic, just the sound of a system activating. You've been speaking our language, Ivara said suddenly. Yes, my lady. For how long? Since about day 30 of my posting, I said. Something happened in her expression. It wasn't easy to read. The Velthari face was structured differently from a human face. The emotions didn't sit in the same places. But there was something there that, in a human, I would have called a kind of recalibration. A reassessment happening in real time. And the things I said, she said, in the early weeks. Yes, my lady. A long pause. You didn't react, she said. No, my lady. Why not? I considered that, because reacting would have required me to believe that your opinion of me was more important than my job, I said, and it wasn't. She looked at me for a long time. Thessaly, from the corner of the room where they'd stationed themselves with that quality of discretion that was essentially a superpower, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. A quiet, private sound, gone immediately. The aftermath of the garden incident took about 3 hours to fully contain. The Velthari House security team located the missing guard, Harath, in a service corridor, bound and sedated, which confirmed that what I'd identified hadn't been paranoia but an actual coordinated operation. The Verak delegates were escorted off the estate before the gathering concluded, which created a diplomatic incident that I understand took several weeks to partially resolve at the conclave level. The Kalandri involvement turned out to be more complicated. They claimed their delegates had been acting independently of House Kalandri direction, which may or may not have been true, and the investigation was ongoing when my posting eventually ended. Nobody was hurt. The operation, whatever it had been, was disrupted before it got far enough to become something I'd have to describe in different terms. But that's not the part of the night that stayed with me. At approximately 3 hours past what the Velthari calendar registered as midnight, Orvis and I were in the corridor outside the study. Ivara had gone to her sleeping chamber, the estate was secured, the immediate situation was managed, and Solver, the senior house guard, came through the corridor. He stopped in front of me. He was about 8 feet tall, skin currently a deep resting state gray. He looked down at me with solid black eyes and those thin rings of bioluminescent light that I'd learned to read well enough by now. The ring color was amber. Amber was, roughly, something like respect, or the beginning of it. He said, in Velthari, how did you know to watch the floor configurations separately from the individual positions? It was a real question, a professional question. Soldier to soldier or guard to guard, something in that register. I said, when individual positions look normal but the geometry between them shifts, that's usually the thing to watch. The pattern is harder to control than the individual. Solver was quiet for a moment, then he said, you've done this type of work before. Yes, I said. On your world. Yes, I said. What is your world like? He asked. It wasn't a dismissive question. He said it the way someone says something when they genuinely want the answer. I thought about how to describe Earth to a being who'd lived most of his life on Solen Prime and aboard conclave stations. About Montana and the Rockies and the wind with the grudge. About the work, the actual physical work. The kind that uses your whole body over years until your body is a different thing than it started as. Complicated, I said. Old, the land is, it's not easy. Most of it isn't. There are places that will kill you if you let your attention go at the wrong time, and there are more species competing for space there than most planets have. I paused. We learned a long time ago to pay attention to rooms. Salver looked at me for a long moment. The briefing materials on your species, he said carefully. Describe your world as a Class M habitable, mid-tier environmental challenge, moderate predator density. Yes, I said. That's the official conclave classification. Is it accurate? I thought about the grizzly bear I'd once spent 45 minutes trying not to be noticed by in the dark, because I'd taken the wrong trail on a late fall day, and my father's voice in my head saying, don't run. Don't make yourself prey. Just be very, very still. I thought about the flash flood that had come down the canyon in the time it took to walk 50 meters. I thought about the blizzard that had trapped 3 cattle in a gully for 2 days, and what they'd looked like when we got them out. Not entirely, I said. He found out properly a few days later. I don't know who looked it up, whether it was Salver or Avara or Thessaly, or all 3 of them, but someone in House Sovereign accessed the galactic database's full entry on Earth. Not the Conclave's official species summary briefing, which was the abbreviated public-facing version, but the full xenobiology and environmental catalog. The one that had the actual numbers in it, the actual classifications. I know because Thessaly told me. About 4 days after the garden incident, Thessaly came to the corridor at the late hour with the dark fruit tea, as usual. Set the cup down, and then, instead of sitting down, stood there with a particular expression on their pale green face. Lady Avara was reading the galactic database last night, Thessaly said. Okay, I said. The full entry on Earth, Thessaly said. I held my teacup and waited. She read it for approximately 4 hours, Thessaly said. I waited. She didn't sleep, Thessaly said. I nodded slowly, took a sip of the tea. She asked me this morning, Thessaly said, to confirm that the database entry was not exaggerated, that the environmental classification data was real and not a record-keeping error. What did you tell her? I said. I told her I believed it was accurate, Thessaly said. And then she asked me to pull the conclave xenobiology record for general Earth wildlife, the full one, not the summary. A pause. She spent another 2 hours on that. I sat with that for a moment. She read about bears, I said. Among many things, Thessaly said, very carefully. I had to press my lips together, and... Thessaly looked at me with those pale green eyes that had, over months, become one of the more genuinely warm presences in my daily life on this posting. She would like to speak with you, Thessaly said. Tomorrow morning, formally, as she used the Velthari term for an acknowledged social equal, not a subordinate. I looked up. That was not a small thing. In Velthari social structure, the terms you used when addressing someone carried enormous weight. You didn't use the equal address for servants. You didn't use it for guards. You used it for peers. She said Verath, I said. In Velthari, Verath was the formal address for a recognized equal. She did, Thessaly said. I was quiet for a moment. She laughed at me on day 19, I said. Yes, Thessaly said. She called me it for the first 2 months, I said. Also yes, Thessaly said, in the tone of someone who was not going to argue with accurate historical accounting. I sat with that, drank my tea, looked at the stone corridor wall, which was the same pale mineral gray it was every night, lit by the same low bioluminescent strips, smelling like the same manufactured limestone rain. Okay, I said finally. Okay, Thessaly said. Tell her I'll be there, I said. Resolution. The morning meeting with Lady Avara Vel-Sovereign was in the study, the same room she'd gone to during the garden incident, the one with the text carvings on the walls and the narrow window that showed a slice of Solen Prime sky at that particular copper blue the dawn made here. She was already there when I arrived, standing near the window. No attendants, even Thessaly was absent, which meant she'd deliberately cleared the room for this. Her skin was at a color I'd been cataloging in my private notes as consideration gold, a warm, reflective tone that she moved into when she was processing something carefully. I stood at the door for a moment, then I stepped inside. She turned. "Ezra Callahan," she said in Velthari. My name in her language sounded slightly different. The vowels were elongated the way Velthari vowels tended to be, but she was saying it. My actual name, not the human, not it, my name. "Lady Avara," I said in Velthari. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said something that I honestly hadn't expected. She said, "I owe you an apology." I kept my face neutral, but inside, something that had been held tight for a long time shifted slightly. "My lady," I started. "No," she said, and her voice she was a controlled person, Avara. She held herself with that centuries-old Velthari discipline that came from living long enough to understand that showing every feeling was expensive. But there was something in her voice that was real and unshielded. "I was dismissive of you. I spoke about you in ways that were beneath the standard I hold for my house, and I did it while you were standing in my corridor doing your job without complaint." She paused. "I have now read the full galactic database entry on your homeworld." "Thessaly mentioned," I said. "Your planet's actual predator density," she said, and there was something in her voice that I would have called, in a human, wonder with an undercurrent of something like startled recognition. "The environmental hazard classification, the gravity differential, the atmospheric composition variables, the temperature range humans not only survive in but work in and build civilizations in." I watched her. "The conclave briefing materials classified Earth as mid-tier," she said. "I know," I said. "That classification," she said carefully, "appears to have been generated by a committee that was working from surface-level observation data and did not conduct a thorough secondary analysis." "That's a diplomatic way to put it," I said. Something happened at the corners of her mouth. Almost a smile, the Velthari version, which was smaller than the human version, a slight change in the angle of the lip structures. "The unofficial xenobiology community classification, which I found in the supplemental research database, used the term Deathworld." "Yeah," I said, "they tend to." Ivara looked at me. Her skin moved through consideration gold into something deeper and more complex. "Why did no one tell me?" she said, and I could hear that this was a genuine question, a confused one, not a political one. "A few reasons," I said. "Partly because the conclave classification system has always been conservative. They don't want to alarm new member species by categorizing Earth in a way that raises uncomfortable questions. Partly because humans who go off-world tend to be good at blending, at not making a thing of it." I paused. "And partly because after about 10,000 years of living on a planet that's been actively trying to kill us in creative ways, we don't really think of it as unusual anymore." She absorbed that. "You don't think of it as unusual," she repeated. "It's home," I said simply. "You grow up knowing how to watch the weather because the weather changes fast and it matters. You learn to read what a piece of land is doing because that knowledge keeps you alive. You learn patience because the things you're working with, the seasons, the animals, the land itself, they don't operate on your schedule." I paused. "All of that it comes with you," I said. "You don't leave it behind because you're on a space station." Ivara was quiet for a long moment. "The garden," she said, "on Myearth 9 the first time." "Yes," I said. "You moved before I was aware there was a reason to move," she said. "Yes." "And 4 nights ago," she said. "Yes." "Both times," she said, "you were watching for a pattern." "Yes," I said. "Because on your world you had to," she said. "Not accusatory, just putting together pieces." "Yes," I said. She looked out the narrow window at the Solen Prime sky, which was doing its color shift thing, moving through copper toward something brighter as the star climbed. She was quiet long enough that I counted internally to about 40. Then she said, "I've lived for 127 years. I have studied 4 species in depth. I have sat on 2 conclave advisory committees. I have read more xenobiology than most Velthari nobles consider necessary." She paused. "I read your database entry and spent 6 hours learning things about your species that made me genuinely ashamed of how I received you." I held that. "You don't have to," I started. "I know I don't have to," she said, sharply but not unkindly. That's not the point. The point is that I should, and I am. Silence. The laugh, she said. Day 19, I remember it. I was showing off for the house visitors. I was being glib. She said the Velthari equivalent of the word, which carried a slightly harsher connotation than the English version. And you stood there and you did not react. No, I said. Why not, she said. Really, not the diplomatic answer. I thought about that. The real answer, not the one you give to a noble. Because my grandfather always said that the way you treat something when you don't think it's watching is the most honest thing about you, I said. And I wanted to know what kind of person you actually were, before I decided what to make of any of it. She looked at me. And, she said, you were complicated, I said, and lonely in the way that brilliant people are lonely when they've never had to be humble. I paused. I got that from Thessaly, actually. Something happened in her face. The almost smile again, but fuller this time, real. Thessaly, she said. Thessaly sees a lot, I said. Yes, she said, they always have. She looked out the window again, then quietly. I would like to hear about your home, Montana, if you're willing to tell me, not for the behavioral study. What for then, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Because I think I've been operating under a fundamental error, she said. I have been measuring your species against criteria that do not apply to you, and I'd like to correct that. I looked at her, at the light from the window catching the iridescent quality of her skin, at the consideration gold color that had settled and deepened into something warmer and more still. I can tell you about Montana, I said. Good, she said, and she gestured to the carved stone bench by the window. And I sat down. We talked for 4 hours that morning. I told her about the land, about what it looks like in January when a Chinook wind comes down off the Rockies and raises the temperature 30 degrees in an hour, and what the cattle do when that happens, and how my father could read which direction the change was coming from by the way the dog held its head. I told her about the fence lines in the dark, and what frostbite feels like in your ears after half an hour in -20, and the particular smell of a blizzard coming. I told her about the grizzly bear. That one she leaned forward for, slightly. I don't know if she knew she was doing it. I told her about the Corps, the recruitment, the training, the things they taught you and the things they didn't. I told her about the adjustment period of being in space, of being on stations and ships and in atmospheric environments that weren't Earth's, and how the first month I'd been profoundly, exhaustingly light. The lower gravity on most station environments made my body feel like it was in a strange dream, and I hadn't quite known what to do with that. She found that interesting. You found the reduced gravity disorienting. It felt like the planet had stopped caring about me, I said, which I know sounds strange. It sounds, she said carefully, like someone who is accustomed to being in active relationship with their environment. I looked at her. Yes, actually, that's exactly it. She nodded slowly. Solen Prime has a slightly higher gravity than galactic standard. I've always preferred it. When I'm on low-gravity stations for extended periods, I feel unmoored. Yes, I said, exactly that. We looked at each other for a moment across the carved stone bench, and there was something in that moment that was odd and warm. The recognition of something shared across a vast distance of species and biology and history. Not the same thing, not exactly, but the same shape of something. Ivara asked me, at some point in the 3rd hour, what I thought of the conclave. Not my official core position on the conclave, which was publicly enthusiastic. My actual thought. I thought about it. I think it's the most important thing that ever happened to my species, I said. And I think we showed up to it completely unprepared, and I think that's probably fine because nobody's ever fully prepared for the most important thing that ever happens to them. I paused. And I think there are people in it, a lot of people, a lot of species, who are going to underestimate us for a while longer yet. And I think we'll be fine. Why, she said. Because we're used to it, I said. On Earth, the land underestimated us for 10,000 years. The weather underestimated us. The predators underestimated us. Most of the things that tried to kill us underestimated us. I paused again. We're pretty comfortable in the position of being underestimated. We tend to use it. Ivara looked at me for a long moment. Her skin had moved over the course of our conversation into a color I didn't have a name for yet in my Velthari vocabulary notes. Something between the consideration gold and the deep iridescent teal I'd seen after the garden, those two things mixing into something new. "What's that color?" I asked, gesturing toward her slightly. She looked down at herself, a tiny pause. "In our language, it's called Velhari Sath." She looked up. "Loosely translated, it's what we call the color of reconsidering something important." I sat with that for a moment,